Hi, everybody, and welcome to Know What You're Talking About. Today, what we're talking about is Topic 5, DQ1, and I have it up right here. GDP is often used as a measure of well-being. Is it a reasonable measure of well-being? If so, why does Norway, with its high standard of living, have a relatively low GDP? Why do India and China, with their relatively low standards of living, have some of the highest GDP in the world? That's kind of a complicated question. It's a big, complicated question that would require a complicated answer. So to get some focus and to understand this a little better, let's go to the rubric for this DQ. And you'll find the rubric, as always, right here. It's the very first post in the DQ. It just says, class, how to get 100% on this DQ and participation. When you open that up, here's the rubric. And it says you get 2.5 points for explaining why Norway's GDP is low, and 2.5 points for explaining why India and China have high GDP. So that gives us some focus, but it's still a difficult question. And so where are we going to find answers to a question like that? Let's go to the textbook. So we're flipping over to MindTap now, and we're in the Topic 5 area here. And we're going to open up Chapter 15, which is on GDP, and open up the interactive textbook and wait for it to load. And the first place we're going to go is to Section 15-2 to get the definition of GDP. Clarifying that from the beginning is going to help us to answer this question better. So the definition of GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given period of time. And I would just bring to your attention that, first of all, there's a video right here. I always encourage you to watch that. And then if you go forward in this section of the textbook, it breaks this down point by point. Market value, all final goods, goods and services. It goes through that entire definition in some detail. So I would just encourage you to be sure and go through that as you're doing your reading. But for this DQ, I think the most important thing to consider here is that GDP is the market value of all goods and services produced. It's really a measure of what the nation has produced in a given period of time. So when we think about how does production happen, in Module 1, in Week 1, we talked about the 4 factors of production. And the 4 factors of production are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Labor, ding, 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 ding. That could be a clue here. So going over to a case study at the end of this chapter, this whole section is GDP a good measure of well-being, which goes to the heart of this GDP. But the case study goes to international differences in GDP and quality of life. And so this will discuss a lot of the issues there. And this gives us the GDP per person. There's a total GDP, total market value of all goods and services produced within a country within a given period of time. And then there's the per person or per capita GDP, which is just GDP divided by population. And so you can see here that the United States per capita GDP is pretty high. These numbers, by the way, are a couple years old. And some of these other nations like India and China, the GDP per capita is much lower. So when we think about the factors of production, labor in itself is a factor. So think about how that might impact the difference between how much Norway is able to produce versus how much India or China is able to produce. And then when you think about GDP per capita, which is a general indicator of standard of living, although those are not exactly the same, you might want to look at some other aspects like and it talks about them in this case study. Some of the things that go into quality of life might also have to do with why India and China produce less per capita than Norway does. And when you put all that together and you think about it a little bit, I'm sure you're going to come up with a great answer to this question. And I look forward to reading your work. Thanks so much for being with me. We'll see you next time on Know What You're Talking About.